Hi everyone, welcome. Great to have you all with us today. I'm really happy to be able to do another show. As you can see, if you watched any of the previous episodes of this show, I've been doing live on YouTube, where you can subscribe. Just search my name, Jack Parrock, and the YouTube channel will come up, and you can subscribe there, please. Thank you. But if you've watched any of the previous episodes, you'll see that I've got a new background. I've gone up into my attic and set myself up rather than doing it over my dining table, as I've been doing until now. So the question today that I want to ask, we've got the Turkish elections coming up this weekend, the first round of it. And I think it's important to, from a Brussels perspective, obviously this show's sort of looking at EU and European affairs, the things that affect the EU, and Turkey has a huge effect on European politics. The relations with Turkey are super important, although perhaps arguably maybe not looked into as much as they should be. So I'm going to do, the way the show's going to work, we're going to do a little rundown of the two main contenders. There are 4 contenders. And then we're going to hear from the ground in Turkey, and then we're going to speak to some experts about what it means to Europe, what needs to happen, what Europe should be looking out for in the elections. So I'll just show you the two men. Here they are, the two men that are basically vying for power right now. The incumbent president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who's been in power for a long time, but as a president since 2014. Sort of a traditionalist. He changed the Hagia Sophia. It was a museum back into a mosque, sort of changing in that direction. Very favored by other players in the Muslim world. And his main contender is Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, who is a 74-year-old leader of an opposition coalition. The coalition parties have really sort of managed to get behind him and get together. He's 74, so he's pretty old. Something we're seeing a lot in politics at the moment. And so these are the two guys really that are going up there. And important to see their faces because we're going to obviously be talking about them. So before we hear about what it means for Europe, I wanted to just bring in Melda Doğan. She's a friend of mine, to be honest, and a really great journalist in Turkey. We worked together during the earthquake in February. We worked intensively over the last couple of days. She was helping me, because I don't speak Turkish, and she was great. So I managed to get her just a little bit earlier to talk about what's going on the ground. So have a listen to what she had to say. Thanks so much for joining me. Where are you? What's going on where you are in Turkey right now ahead of these elections?
Thank you so much for having me, Jack. Well, I am in central Anatolia, in Kayseri. This is in the middle of Turkey, very conservative city. They have voted 70% for Erdogan in the previous presidential elections, but that was 5 years ago when the economy was doing still better than now, when things were smoother. And now my expectation before coming here was that most of the people, I mean, at least a portion of the people who voted for Erdogan will not vote for him anymore, because this city, Kayseri, is known for being a trade center, and it's an industrial city. So it's a rich city, actually. I was thinking that maybe the businessmen affected by the bad economy will not vote for him anymore. But we have been visiting and interviewing people in the shops, also some businessmen in the industrial area, and they seem to not give up on Erdogan. That's the case so far.
What are the main points in this election right now? The earthquake is surely a massive factor for people, but that was in one region of Turkey. People outside of that region, do they care about that? Do they care about the inflation and the economy, the relations with Greece? What are people voting on right now?
Well, 2 things, Jack, at this point. The economy is number one. Young, old, right, left, everyone is talking about the economy, because it's impossible to get by with this prices, with the inflation. It's almost impossible to survive. So economy is number one thing. And number 2 is, especially for the youth, freedom. When I say about freedom, it's the freedom of expression, feeling free in terms of being able to post on social media without thinking whether you will be in prison or not, and also the discriminative language of Erdogan, the fact that he has been, kind of dividing the society in terms of going. I mean, he called women at some point, right? And then we still hear this divisive language from Erdogan and from his party members as well. Actually, last week, one of the party members, Bekir Bozdağ, said, on May 14, people will decide whether they want to celebrate the election results by drinking champagnes or by praying. This is like dividing the society. You're either drinking champagne or you're praying.
And it will be
so
one
many
side
people-
or the other, though, right? Just like
Ye-
it's so one or the other, the opposition parties or Erdogan. That's it. It's a binary choice right now.
There are four candidates for the elections, right? But still, the two other candidates, they have votes around 5% or maybe less. So it's between Kılıçdaroğlu and Erdogan mostly. But why the other candidates matter is that it's very complicated, because there are people who are not willing to vote for Erdogan because of the economy and the reaction to earthquake as well. But they also don't feel comfortable for voting for Kılıçdaroğlu because HDP expressed support for Kılıçdaroğlu, right? And HDP is also the Kurdish party, as you know. So people who are more nationalistic and they don't want to side with the Kurdish party, but they're also not happy with Erdogan, they're going to vote for the other candidates. But what are these people going to do on the second round is still a question mark. And so many people are still undecided. They haven't decided. They haven't made their mind yet. It's so many indecisive voters, especially, I would say, for AKP voters who are not happy. They are indecisive.
Yeah. And that second round is going to be really crucial. And it's very likely that it's going to come down really to that. This is a long process in these Turkish elections. Just finally, Melda, before I let you go, because I'm super busy, we've seen some sort of stuff, huge rallies of the opposition coalition, huge rallies of Erdogan. There's been videos circling on social media, sort of scuffles between police and between different groups. What's it like there? Is that, after the last election, and there's a lot of, there's been difficulties. We saw the coup attempt in recent years. It's tense in Turkey right now,
It's tense. Actually, I'm not expecting anything like protests or people going out on the streets. I don't feel it right now. I think everyone is so excited about the elections that they're waiting for the results. So you see now I'm on the main square I can show you around a little bit actually if you want, in Kayseri. It's like different parties are next to each other and they're campaigning. So it's kind of
it's friendly
environment.
It's friendly,
It's friendly. Yeah. It's friendly. Like here you see, the Zafer Partisi, for example, anti-immigrant racist party. And then next to it, you have the leftists. And it's like complicated. They're all next to each other. They're all trying to convince people.
I mean, that is the plurality of democracy,
yeah.
But there's
that's
worries
amazing.
about Erdogan clamping down on that, though, right?
That's amazing. But I think... I don't know. It's difficult to say. When it comes to Turkey, Jack, it's almost impossible to make any guess. Because even in this situation, there's still people who are like, Erdogan is the best. We're going to support him because he's defending our country and he's defending the Islam, the religion. So that ideology still exists. And no matter what, you cannot convince those people to vote for CHP, right? It's almost impossible to make them vote for CHP. But you still have the Saadet Partisi, which is Islamist party, sided with CHP. You have two ex-ministers of Erdogan who sided with CHP, with Kılıçdaroğlu, who are all together. So it's very complicated. I was at the rally of CHP on Saturday, and I've seen like proper like women in burqa, hijabi women, well, people from all walks of life, like all different kind of people from different backgrounds. So it's gonna be a surprising, but the AKP rally was also surprisingly very crowded. Like we couldn't get into the main square, into the main area. It was so crowded.
Huge.
It's so crowded. So it's difficult to make any guess at this point.
Yeah, it's hard to know. Melda, thank you so much. I know you're super busy. Good luck with your continued reporting. And yeah, speak to you soon, mate. Thank you. So that was super interesting to hear from Melda on the ground there. Just to give a bit of color about exactly what's happening in the elections. And this, I think what she was explaining and what she was outlining is how different and divided this election is. But I want to dig in a little bit more about the sort of practicalities from a European perspective. That was the idea. I thought we needed to sort of lay the ground with Melda there to hear what's happening in Turkey. But my friend Samuel Doveri-Vesterbayer from the European Neighbourhood Council, the director of that organisation, is joining me from somewhere that looks fantastic, Sam.
Merhaba. Hello. I'm not in Brussels. So
no, I can see.
I apologize for that. I'm on holiday, but because Jack is a great journalist who has covered of course, the very important and tragic events in the earthquake, and we know each other for a long time, I'm very happy to join you to talk about this very important discussion.
Right, so let's get into it. Thanks, mate, for taking time out of your holiday. What does the result of we've heard? It's a relatively binary choice right now, either Erdogan or the opposition coalition. What's Europe looking out for? What are EU politicians looking for in this election? The migration deal, relations with Greece. What do you think?
Well, I think first it's important to remember that it is true, it's very polarized and somewhat binary, but it's not entirely binary because there is a parliamentary election and a presidential election happening simultaneously, at least on the first round. So that means that, what we could see is, for example, a parliamentary election going to AKP and Tayyip Erdogan, and then the presidential election going to the opposition, for example, or the legislative election again going to the government, because as most people who know Turkey a little bit know, the gerrymandering and the electoral rules and laws are quite tilted in favor of the current government position or current government party when it comes to legislative elections. But for example, it could go on to second round. And so it's not entirely binary. I think it's important to remember that there is this legislative and presidential election going on. When it comes to what Brussels thinks, I mean, we're a few dozen experts and foreign policy advisors who've been working on Turkey for a long time in Brussels and who've been advising on these subjects. And without a doubt, Europe is the EU is somewhat divided with regards to these elections, in the sense that there are certain member countries who have a very strong and long-standing relationship with Turkey, both in economic, migratory, defense, and other terms, and as a result, really are not so interested in that much change or any instability and so forth. They're not against the opposition winning, but they're not particularly against Erdogan staying in power either.
Let's break it down then. Let's talk about that. So countries that would be a bit more of sort of better the devil you know than the one you don't know. What countries might favor just sticking with Erdogan? We're gonna know how to deal with him even if we don't like it.
Some new EU member states from Eastern Europe, some Visegrad countries would not be so against that. They're mostly concerned about the migration deal. Some of them have been purchasing Bayraktars and have been purchasing defense equipment from Turkey in recent years. And many of them have growing educational, university, people-to-people, economic, foreign direct investment relations that, of course, they're not particularly interested in seeing in any kind of way disrupted. Another country which is not in that category, of course, but which is nonetheless important is Germany. Germany is a country which anyone who knows German foreign policy knows very well that Germany has two sides to its foreign policy. It has one very, very strong trade component and one very strong and deeply ingrained human rights component. And the human rights component have an issue with the current government in Turkey, especially Tayyip Erdogan, because of his track record over the last few decades. Whereas the trade component is very enthusiastic about relations with Turkey, and of course would also be enthusiastic with trade relations with new government in Turkey, provided that there is a stable transition.
So what about Greece? I mean, one of the big issues, you mentioned the migration deal, and we'll come back to that, but Greece has been consistently concerned about Turkey. That Erdogan's sort of come out and said that he could nab an island overnight. Does Greece want a new face running Turkey?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so I think with regards to Greece, it's very, very clear. It's very, very clear that they would significantly favor an opposition government who have been much more mild on the rhetoric vis-a-vis Greece. However, it should nonetheless be remembered that even the opposition, Kılıçdaroğlu, CHP, and the rest of the alliance have nonetheless also mentioned that they're not totally apathetic on the Eastern Mediterranean question. But I think any foreign policy advisor would be of the opinion that it will be a much, much easier relationship with the opposition government coming into place when it comes to dealing with, especially with Greece, the Eastern Mediterranean, and Cyprus.
What about the relations with Russia? Because, Turkey, despite being a NATO member, has continued to buy S-400 missile systems from Russia. Erdogan doesn't seem to really care about, what's going on. He sort of plays both sides in that sense. Do you think the foreign policy of any new government will change? Also, do you think his foreign policy might change if he's re-elected?
Yeah, it's a good question. So there's multiple hypotheses surrounding this subject. I mean, first of all, it's not a hypothesis. One thing is a fact, which is Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu only a few days ago mentioned very, very clearly that his foreign policy vis-a-vis balancing between East and West, or Russia and the West, would be firmly in the Western camp. So he made that very, very clear only a few days ago. So on that subject, I don't think there's any doubt. With regards to the current government and Tayyip Erdogan, there are various hypotheses. One hypothesis is that once and if he manages to continue to stay in power, he will feel secure enough not to have to balance between East and West any longer. It's a hypothesis. Another hypothesis is that once he gains more power, if he feels somehow cornered or threatened, he will balance more towards Russia. So I think there are multiple theories and hypotheses around this, but I think based on simply of what's been said in the last few weeks, electoral weeks, it's pretty clear that the opposition has firmly declared to be in the Western camp, whereas with the current government, there's still a question mark.
So one of the things with relations with Turkey is always, from a European perspective, has always been trust. So will they do what they say they're going to do, and will they sort that out? Would you agree there that that's part of the sort of functioning complications of the relationship? Do you understand that there is a sense in Brussels that, or among or around European capitals, that there would be more trust in the opposition coalition?
Yeah, I think there's no doubt about that. I think unfortunately, it doesn't necessarily even have much to do with the party necessarily, but over the last 2 decades, there's been a gradual erosion of trust between the EU and Turkey on so many different levels because of everything related to the failed, Annan plan, democratic backsliding, suspicions over Gezi Park and the failed coup, imprisoned journalists and so forth. I mean, this has, of course, had an enormously negative impact on relations. But also from the other perspective, I mean, chapters in the accession process were not opened or were closed arbitrarily. Things like, for example, energy policy has not been pursued in a way which, for example, Turkish diplomats would consider constructive and so on. So there's a lot of mistrust which has fermented over the years. I don't think that mistrust will go away entirely overnight, but there will be some kind of high-level president to president or president to prime minister new momentum and trust, which will make it a lot easier, I think, to work.
Yeah. Samuel, stay with me. I'm going to bring in Ali Mustafa, who's a freelance journalist, a friend as well, who has worked out of Turkey for many, many years. I think you're in London right now, Ali.
I am indeed.
Great to have you. Thanks so much for joining the show. What's your view on this, the Turkish election from an external point of view? Are you seeing international players, especially in Europe, make moves, make sort of changes in their opinion? Are there shifting tectonic plates towards what's happening in Turkey right now?
Well, before we begin, thank you for having me, Jack. And I'd like to tell your viewers, I am not a Turk. I'm not a Turkish citizen. I'm an outsider. But one thing I can tell you, being an outsider who first arrived in May 2015, just before elections that year, that basically allowed the pro-Kurdish, if you can call it that, HDP or HDP, it crossed the 10% threshold and it made it into parliament. Keep in mind, Turkey then was a parliamentary democracy, parliamentary system. It changed in 2019 to a presidential system, and these elections are being held in that context. But the reason I raised 2015 and the HDP entering parliament for the first time, Kurdish group crossed the 10% threshold and effectively became a kingmaker. And it seems that it's come full circle. Once again, the HDP leader, Selahattin Demirtas, has been in prison for many years now, but he has given an unequivocal support to the so-called united candidate of the table of six, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, and is in a position where it can potentially be a kingmaker. But where there is strength, there is also a huge weakness. Because I think in the West, or as far as Europe is concerned, this is being framed in terms of authoritarian slide versus democracy. Whereas in Turkey, this is a question of security. This is a question of quote unquote terrorism. This country lost 45,000 people in the span of 40 years fighting a group which eventually became allied with the Americans in Syria, as part of, or in the form of the SDF or YPG. So I think what I'm trying to get at, and I was listening to comments made by your previous guests on balancing between East and West, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu will still have to operate in a Turkish context. There are a lot of question marks attached to his candidacy because for the nationalist Turk, and let me tell you, a majority of Turks are extremely nationalistic. This is a question of supporting a candidate which is allegedly backed by terrorists who have claimed countless lives, as opposed to a strong man who says, I'm fighting against terrorism and I will ensure that Turkey emerges as a global power at the front of a Turkic union that spans from Turkey, even Hungary, some would say, all the way to Kazakhstan and beyond. So I think it's a critical moment. I think there is a possibility that Erdogan might lose, but whoever or whatever follows next, even if Erdogan comes next, will have to operate in that context, in that nationalistic context. And if you are in that, go on.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, do you think there's an awareness of that then in Europe and by the Americans? Do you think there's an understanding of that, or there's a temptation, I think, especially around European capitals, to be like, a new broom sweeps clean, but perhaps in this instance, you're suggesting maybe not. What gains can European partners or European governments or European Union institutions here in Brussels get out of a new relationship with a new leadership, or what can they do if Erdogan gets back in?
Well, listen, Erdogan is a pragmatist, is an uber pragmatist. You haven't seen a pragmatist like this. He is willing to make a deal with his enemies and beyond, regardless of past animosity or past history. We saw this with the refugee deal, well, the ill-fated refugee, EU-Turkey refugee deal in 2015. We've seen it with the Russians, how Erdogan has dealt with them with the downing of, or from the downing of the Russian fighter jet to now them being so close. There's an energy compact there. So there are a lot of layers. You can't just simplify Turkey in terms of, oh, is it pro or anti, west or east? The previous guest said it's a balancing act, and Erdogan is a master tactician. He has been balancing these things throughout his political career. Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu is an unknown entity, and it's not just him. It's a table of six plus the HDP. So what happens to this coalition? Does it survive? Before Erdogan, before the AK Party came in, this country had a history of either military coups or spurts of democracy, and coalition governments would just collapsed. So that stability and the vision or the mold that has been set over the past 20 years, if it doesn't continue or if it fragments or fractures, well, then I think Europe will have more questions.
Yeah.
As opposed to...
And Europe knows failing coalitions better than any place in the world. Samuel, I want to bring you back in, mate, on this. Ali was just talking there about the refugee deal. This was a huge deal that was struck in 2015 to try and stop the people from left Syria coming into the European Union. 3 billion euros, up to 6 billion. It ended up being basically paying off the Turkish government to hold Syrian refugees in Turkey. What's the status of this deal right now? How is it working? What might change? How does it go forward?
Well, I think just like Ali mentioned before, Tayyip Erdogan is a ultra pragmatist. So whenever he can get a good injection of currency into the country, he'll take it, and that's essentially what that migration deal has been about. The problem is that there are two errors which have been committed vis-a-vis this refugee deal. One was the fact that the Turkish government probably accepted it, and because they were cash strapped and needed that. And the second mistake was that the EU offered it, as the EU has also done elsewhere. And I think the mistake is that it was very short-term thinking. You can also see these kind of mistakes when it comes to which countries in the EU sign or do not want to sign the common asylum policy. Common asylum policy would have been an easy way for, if all member countries signed it, all 27 member countries signed it, they would be able to redistribute refugees across all countries in an equitable way, in which it wouldn't really cause any economic or cultural or whatever people complain about hazard on an individual country level. However, that's not happening. A lot of countries are vetoing or not willing to sign this, and the same thing is kind of applied to the refugee deal. A lot of countries are thinking short term, and they don't want to think long term. Long term thinking, which would be beneficial both to the EU and to Turkey, would to try to align common security and foreign policy. We have a whole range of chapters in the accession process. Whether or not that frozen process will go back on track or not is a different story. But there are a whole range of kind of chapters which deal with foreign and security policy, in which the EU and Turkey should, as geographically aligned partners and geographically destined partners, essentially cooperate more. They should make sure that countries like Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq are not completely unstable, and as a result don't have constant waves of forced migration that are creating problems for both the EU and Turkey, and which are creating an enormous migration sentiment, negative migration sentiment in Turkey, probably best demonstrated by this new Zafari party, which will probably gain a substantial amount of votes.
Let me wind it back. You mentioned there sort of the EU accession process. I know you talk a lot about the customs union, which is the sort of trading bloc with the European Union that Turkey is in right now, and the update on that. Structurally, sort of within the agreement, so this customs union where goods can pass freely between Turkey and the European Union, and perhaps politically, with the accession process, which you said, as you said, is completely frozen. What's the current status of EU-Turkey relations in your assessment on those issues?
Well, I mean, I think the current state of EU-Turkey relations is unfortunately a very frozen one. It's one in which both entities don't aim for the full potential. We have to remember that Turkey, especially after the war in Ukraine, is the only land bridge left connecting the European continent with Asia. So Turkey plays a very, very important strategic role for the EU, and even more so now since there's sanctions and a war ongoing between Russia and Ukraine. Additionally, this accession process, I think it would be wise for everyone to remember that this accession process has been ongoing for a while, and that because of a variety of different reasons, I would argue mistakes both on the EU and on Turkey's side has been frozen over the years. And now it's very unlikely for Turkey to basically re-enter that process. Some are arguing that with the election of Kılıçdaroğlu, or the potential election of Kılıçdaroğlu, there could be a renewed accession process. I'm very cautious about that argument, considering the fact that there are certain EU member countries that are simply unwilling to continue accession process. And that's not necessarily because they have an issue with Turkey per se. They have a problem with the general concept of enlargement, because the concept of enlargement essentially means that deeper integration becomes much more difficult. So when one says they don't want enlargement, it doesn't necessarily mean I don't like Estonia, I don't like Turkey, I don't like Ukraine, etc., etc. It often means, in realistic terms, I want to pursue, for example, harmonized taxation and Tobin tax. That's often been the argument of France, for example. It's not really necessarily a problem with these countries. It's more the fact that they want to have much deeper integration. That becomes more difficult when enlargement continues. So I think
there's a huge population in Turkey as well. So
there's a huge population.
The voting right. I mean, it's just unthinkable, really, to have Turkey as an EU member in any real sort of conversation, right?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, I think huge population is not always a disadvantage. When you look at, for example, customs union reform, huge population of Turkey is a major advantage. Like, for example, when I've spoken to business associations from France, Germany, Italy, other places, some of the things that they're mentioning is we want to pilot smart city applications, and we can't really do it in Rome, Paris, or in Berlin. We need cities with 15 million plus people, so we can only do it with Istanbul. So there's also a lot of demand for integrating Turkey into an reformed customs union with the EU, in which piloting of various types of business ventures is possible, in which supply chain expansions can occur, especially considering the fact that so many supply chains have been moved away from the Russian northern corridor in the last year and a half or so, and something which will continue and we'll see more of. I mean, I often ask myself this question. I mean, to be brutally frank, whoever wins after this election, in some ways, the unavoidable destiny of the EU remains geographic and remains geographically tied together with Turkey, whether it's Kılıçdaroğlu or Tayyip Erdogan, to be honest. And I think it's important to remember the amount of supply chains and companies that are operating inside of Turkey today is astonishingly high. Let me give one example. Germany alone has 7,500 companies operating inside of Germany, or inside of Turkey, sorry. If you compare that just with China, China only has 1,200. I mean, I think that's quite important just to relativize.
Yeah. I'm gonna stop you there, Samuel, and I'm gonna bring Ali back in. I've seen you've been nodding your head. Sorry, I've been muting you, Ali, because there's a bit of background noise. I can see you keep pressing it. Apologies. But what do you make of that? This idea of integration. I mean, this idea of futures intertwined no matter what happens. Are we aware enough of it?
My question then to Samuel and you would be integrating into what? There isn't one Europe. There isn't one European Union. There are lessers within Europe as well. Not everyone is part of the single currency. Not everyone has the same needs. Eastern Europe, Southern Europe have a huge energy shortfall. Well, even I guess Germany and France have a huge energy shortfall. And the only one of the only lifelines direct is coming via Turkey. We talk about the movement of goods through a customs union, but what about the movement of energy through these pipes that are being built from Azerbaijan, Tanap, from the Blue Stream pipeline coming from Russia into Turkey, and Turkey basically becoming into this dilution center of sorts, this transition hub for energy from the east to the west. What's that role? And when you talk about Turkey as a peg or a cog, you've got the Black Sea. Ukraine is no longer a dominant power in the Black Sea after the invasion. You've got Russia and Turkey to balance it off. You've got Turkey in the Mediterranean. You've got Turkey in the Middle East. And then you've got Turkey with Eastern Europe. So what kind of Europe are we talking about? Are these things still the same? Does Turkey even want to be part of the European Union? Yes, on the face of it, they would say yes. Right. But behind doors, they say, we want to make our own union. We want to be that driving force militarily, population-wise, 83 million people. But there's also the stigma when you have European leaders coming out and saying, well, the EU will always be Christian. You've got 83 million Muslims trying to get into the European Union, and nobody answers those questions. So I think a lot of things have moved, but the questions, it seems, have remained stuck in the past. They need to evolve, especially after Brexit. We're sitting in London. The economy here is terrible. There's, inflation is off the charts, not like Turkey, but there are a lot of these questions and a lot of things have moved on, but the debate seems fixated on these accession talks. I don't think that's going to happen ever. And I don't think any reasonable Turk thinks this is going to ever happen either. But there will be new contexts that will emerge, especially around energy, especially around, as what Samuel was saying, an industrial base, which Turkey has emerged as. So I think this multipolarity will change the questions and change the context in which these questions are being asked.
Yeah, let me talk to you about that. You mentioned grain and stuff like that. You've spent time in Ukraine recently. As you said, Ukraine isn't the power in the Black Sea, and it required Turkey to come in and do that. So, I mean, when we talk about these elections and what might happen afterwards, Erdogan, as we've said already in this, has been relatively good at sort of, as you said, a sort of superstar pragmatist, wangling his way between all the different sort of international powers. Is it good for? I mean, a lot of Turks are very unhappy with how he runs the country domestically, but on the international scene, he has managed to duck and dive through that. Is he a useful player for the Europeans and for the Americans in playing that middleman role as well? Ali?
I think that's a question best asked from the Europeans or the Americans. But if you ask the Turks, and many Turks, even the ones who have economically suffered and who domestically oppose Erdogan's authoritarian quote-unquote tilt, they'll say, you know what if we could find a perfect world where Erdogan would deal with foreign affairs and somebody else would deal with domestic affairs? I've had a few people from various sides talk about this. Well, not from the opposition side, but there is this middle ground in Turkey where they see themselves in these grand terms, where they see this nationalism or this strength that Erdogan begins on the international arena. And yes, Ukraine, he played a huge role in that, and he'll continue to play a role in that, or Turkey will continue to play a role in that. But after Ukraine, the way the Turks perceive themselves and the way the country perceives itself has changed drastically. It's more militaristic. The narrative is more militaristic. There's more focus on, and keep in mind, we don't talk about this much, but there's a complete artillery shortage in the West. We talk about the Russians being on the back foot in Bakhmut. They're running out of artillery, but the West has run out of artillery. The stockpiles are gone, and you're looking at years-long waits to basically replenish that stocks, those stocks of artillery to be supplied to Ukraine. So, there's some sort of disconnect between what's happening on the ground in a lot of these places, in Turkey, in Ukraine, for example, and what is happening in the capitals in Brussels and Washington, D.C., where it's all about Slava Ukraine. It's all about, we're going to win. The Russians are evil. We're going to defeat them. Well, the world is more complicated and more complex than that. And I think Turkey represents this complexity perfectly. And whoever wins, regardless, on March 15th or March 29th, you will see this complexity emerge even more pronounced afterwards.
Yeah, do you know what, Ali? I can't agree with you more. One of the previous episodes I did with this is like, is Western support for Ukraine waning a little bit? Because the open conversations that happen at a political level, especially internationally, especially in Europe, are not the same ones that happen behind closed doors, and that is just this the reality of all politics. But the truth of it is always ever shifting. Ali, thank you so much for joining us on the show. I'll let you go. I really, really appreciate you taking the time, and good to speak to you, and I'll speak to you soon.
Take care.
Samuel, I'll come back to you just quickly, just to finish up, because you follow these things closely. Do you think that the elections and the subsequent rounds are being watched closely in Brussels? You said, you guys are looking at it. There's a lot going on at the moment, and it just doesn't feel like these Turkish elections are sort of being discussed in European circles as much as perhaps they should.
I'm happy to answer that question. I just wanted to make one comment about what you spoke with Ali about just a second ago. You mentioned the fact that there's some like a fall in pro-Ukrainianness and so on. My perception is not one of a fall in pro-Ukrainianness. When I go to Kazakhstan, when I go to Kyrgyzstan, when I go to Azerbaijan, what I'm actually witnessing is the opposite. I'm seeing these what are considered, post. I don't like using this word, but many would categorize them as ex-Soviet Union countries that since receiving independence in the 1990s have nonetheless maintained a lot of energy relations, a lot of economic relations. They're heavily intertwined in their business and security relations with Moscow, and nonetheless their populations are expressing an enormous amount of pro-Ukrainianness.
Yeah,
both in terms of
okay. Well, I want to keep it on Turkey. So we did that episode. I should have had you on then.
Yeah.
But so what are you thinking for these elections? Are you worried about what's going to happen there? Turkish democracy is difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I've been maybe sometimes branded as the bearer of bad news among colleagues and friends. A lot of people are very excited about the current lead up to the elections and the momentum which undoubtedly the opposition has created. I'm cautiously optimistic because I fear that due to the levels of polarization in Turkey, due to the well-documented level of online foreign interference from Russia over the past year and more, and due to the fact that there is a winner-takes-all mindset with fear of retribution for the winner and or loser. As a result of these factors, I think that there is a risk that these elections, also looking at previous elections, for example, in Istanbul and elsewhere, that these current elections now will be contested and disputed. And I don't know exactly what the consequences will be of that, but I don't think that's a very positive expectation. And unfortunately, I think it's a somewhat realistic expectation to have. And I then, my first recommendation and advice to experts and foreign policymakers and the EU as well has been, let's look at what the OSCE and the ODIHR electoral monitoring mission in Turkey, which will have 300 women, men, staff monitoring these elections, and which will be the largest independent international monitoring mission. So let's have a look a little bit at their interim report. And in their interim report, unfortunately, it does recommend and mention that in case of electoral dispute, one of the recommendations of ODIHR in the past, and also in the interim report, has been that the election dispute can go all the way to the constitutional judges in Turkey, which is not the case at the moment. So I think what I'm trying to say is essentially that there's a risk of polarization and election contestation and dispute. And in that case, what will be in that eventual case, what will be very, very important is that everyone, of course, reverts to what the opposition and the government have to say in first place. But if there's not consensus between them, that they then revert to the OSCE and ODIHR mission. And not that any of these institutions will be able to essentially do arbitration, but at least they'll be able to have an independent, international, and non-arbitrary opinion about these elections.
Yeah, it's going to be super interesting. Samuel, thank you so much. You're breaking up a little bit there. So this is probably a good moment to wrap it up anyway. Thanks so much for joining the show today. I really appreciate it, Samuel. It's been super interesting.
Thank you so much, Jack.
Oh, I cut him off a bit earlier. So thanks so much to Samuel for joining, and to Ali as well, and to Melda for bringing their expertise. Conversation is so complex, even as I'm talking about it. Like, I've followed Turkish politics for many years myself, and EU-Turkey relations, and you just see, even by the conversation, the way that it strays into different areas, because it's in the middle of so much and it's so delicate. I think the election is going to be super interesting, and I think that it's really important that people pay attention. It's a huge democracy. So thanks everyone for joining. I really appreciate it. Now, if you've got any comments on the discussion, please feel free to write them wherever you're watching. I follow everything, I read everything, and I reply to everything where I possibly can. Yeah, subscribe to the YouTube channel. It makes it easy for me to continue to do these shows. And this week I'm doing 2 shows. So on Friday evening, Friday, I think 4 p.m. Central European time, hopefully, maybe a little bit later, depending on when I can fit it in. I'll be doing a special show on the politics of Eurovision ahead of the Eurovision Song Contest on Saturday, and I'll be discussing, just with Dave Keating, who's joined the show before, exactly what the background politics are, LGBT politics around it, whether the Ukrainian hosts, but obviously it's being held in the UK, whether there's a bit of conflict there, some conflicts around the languages that are being used and what's going on. Dave's a proper expert on that. So please join the show, like, subscribe, comment, retweet, whatever. Really supports me in this little venture that I'm doing, and I really appreciate everyone for joining. Okay, have a great evening. Thanks, everyone.